thank you to Rolf for the invitation to come and join in the very interesting discussion so far, and for giving me the opportunity to almost be Britney Spears for the next half hour. So I'm going to talk about some work we've been doing at Newcastle and with the Tyndall Centre in the UK on the links between land use and transport and climate change. So my title was Climate Change and Transport, but there is some land use in here as well. And I'm not a land use transport modeler. I'm a person who sits amongst lots of other modelers, climate modelers, transport modelers, and tries to integrate these models together and think about the systemic problems of climate change in cities. So this will be a kind of broad overview of the work we've been doing with a little bit of detail of the models we've been doing, but also lots of questions that I want to throw back at the eminent people in this room and problems that I foresee coming up over the next few years. So hopefully we can get a stimulated discussion going. So most of you will be aware that the Paris Climate Change Agreement was signed last December, and as of last month, it reached enough countries ratifying the treaty to mean that it will come into force. Well, it has already. No, it will in 1 day's time, on the 4th of November. So it means the Paris Agreement is now a legal document. The UK has not signed it yet, to its shame, but I think probably will eventually. So what does the Paris Agreement actually say? Well, it says that governments of the world will limit global temperature rise to well below 2 degrees Celsius above pre-industrial levels and pursue efforts to limit it to 1.5 degrees Celsius. It's a very nice thing to say, but in reality, little action has actually been, we've not seen any action over the last 15 years, serious action really to pursue these kinds of reductions in emissions. Our emissions are 60% higher now than they were in 1990 when a lot of these processes started happening, and CO2 in the atmosphere is as high as it's been in nearly 1 million years. And at the current rate of emissions, within about 5 to 8 years, we'll have used up the carbon budget. So scientists calculate how much CO2 you need in the atmosphere to lead to certain temperature rises with a lot of uncertainty, but to the best of their estimation, within about 5 to 8 years, we'll have used up all of the budget for 1.5 degrees temperature rise. And that's a very short time scale. And limiting warming to 2 degrees, as the Paris Agreement says, will require unprecedented levels of change, I would say, but certainly drastic change, that the kind of discussions we see at government level are insufficient, I would say, to see the level of change we need. And I quite like this quote from Richard Feynman, who said that for a successful technology, reality must take precedence over public relations, because you can't fool nature, essentially. But if we replace technology with policy, then I would say the same thing. If we're going to have policies that are going to be successful, then we have to be aware of the reality of those policies and what they actually mean in terms of the changes we have to see in society and in the world. So what are the implications? What is the reality of the Paris Agreement? Well, Kevin Anderson, who's a colleague of mine at the Tyndall Centre, says that what we need to see is a war-like footing, kind of World War II style mobilization of economies and technology to try and make these changes come into reality. And the IPCC themselves, the UN's Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, estimate that we've probably got about a 33% chance, that should say, of achieving 2 degrees warming based on current knowledge and policies. And this graph that Kevin Anderson put together shows the kinds of cuts that we need to see in energy demand over the next reasonably short timescale to try and achieve these pledges, or this agreement. The 2 degrees warming will be the most we'll see in the world. I mean, the pledges, the INDCs, are the pledges that the countries have already made in the world to their emissions reductions, and they're putting us on course, if those pledges come into reality, on a 3.5 degree global warming. Now, that's average global temperature. Some parts of the world will be much hotter than that. So to get a 2 degree world, we need pretty much, according to Kevin Anderson's calculations on the global carbon budget, 10% reduction in CO2 emissions every year starting now, and fully decarbonized economy and society, energy production by 2035, which is not very long from now. For reference, the EU submission to the Paris Agreement looks at a 40% reduction by 2030, which some might argue is ambitious in itself. So alongside the national level agreements, at the COP in Paris last year, cities across the world also got together to discuss what climate change meant at a city level. And the Paris City Hall Declaration was produced, which saw 1,000 city leaders say that they would agree as cities to advance and exceed the expected goals of the Paris Agreement, which was reached at the COP21. So mayors and governments in cities know the scale of the challenge and have committed to change as well. So we can see that, as land use transport modelers, we generally work in cities, and we know that, well, these changes are going to happen. 2 degrees or 1.5 degrees is still a change. And so cities have to adapt in some way. They have to make themselves more resilient, and they have to expect that changes to the climate will come. And they play an important role themselves in this transition from our current way of doing things into a more sustainable future. And we know that certain cities already in the world are much more efficient than others in transport terms or in energy terms. We can learn from them. Cities are also the perfect place to look at things like co-benefits, where investment in carbon reduction might give us other benefits in terms of quality of life or biodiversity, etc. But we should try and show where we have limits in these things. So using things like cost assessments to calculate, how much would the cost be of all of this, and what would the benefits be, etc. So knowledge about the gross effects at national level are important for kind of global policy making, but what we need at city scale is much more detailed information about the impacts that we might expect to see and the effects of changes in policy or technology. And I would say that land use and transportation are quite key to this transition from our current world to a more sustainable future that is in line with the Paris Agreement that is now in force. So there's this problem, this tension in cities between adaptation, which is adapting our cities to be resilient to the changes we expect to see, and mitigation, which is trying to avoid those changes happening or the severity of those changes being too high. And there are lots of options that we can put in place to adapt to climate change, but those adaptations may sacrifice or damage our ability to reduce our emissions. So we have to try and find solutions that allow us to become more resilient to the changes that will happen, but at the same time, reduce our emissions and become more sustainable in the way we do things. So we've looked at a few of these kind of trade-offs here between certain adaptation technologies, but then the bigger negative impacts that they may have in other areas of the economy or of the natural systems. So what we've tried to do in the Tyndall Centre is come up with a blank screen, a framework that allows us to look at adaptation and mitigation together in an integrated way. So an integrated assessment framework for urban areas called the Urban Integrated Assessment Framework. So we start with the kind of national scale or global scale phenomena of socioeconomic change and climate change. So if you think about Michael Wegener's description yesterday of his multi-scale, multi-level model, this is a similar kind of idea, that there are big processes that happen at a global or a continental or a national scale, and we try and downscale those. So we worked with Cambridge Econometrics in the UK who use a model of the regional economy and have economic forecasts. And then those economic forecasts drove a very simple, by comparison to some of the people's models in this room, land use transport model, which Mike Batty at UCL developed, and which we've since carried on development of. So this was a kind of gravity model, very simple accessibility, employment driving population locations, and we looked at different scenarios on a very broad city scale, nowhere near the level of detail that some of the models discussed here have had, but it's a way of allowing us to look at very general scenarios of the future and general kind of stories of trajectories that we may want to go in. And by putting together these trajectories of land use and transport with climate scenarios downscaled to city scale by people like the Met Office in the UK, we can start to see, well, where are coincident socioeconomic changes and climate impacts happening? So where might we see an increase in flood risk and then an increase in land development for housing? And then what we wanted to do eventually was see how we can avoid those impacts being as great as they might be. So by land use and transport policies, or by policies that change the emissions and therefore reduce the climate impacts, how we can avoid the damage happening. At the same time, we looked at greenhouse gas emissions from the same consistent set of scenarios, so for transport emissions or energy from the economy as well, so energy use in buildings. And the idea was eventually, if you put together all of these different perspectives into a set of policy options, you've got a consistent story about policy A has this effect on emissions, but it has this effect on resilience, and it has this effect on land use and transport. And so we can go to policymakers, and we worked with the Mayor of London's office and the Environment Agency and Transport for London to try and talk through these big picture stories, not talk through the detail of the models necessarily, but if you pursue an avenue of densification, it may reduce your transport emissions, but if you densify in the wrong places, you may be increasing your exposure to flood risk or heat wave risk in the future. So this is work we did in 2008, 2009, and published a little brochure for cities to talk us through. And it's still ongoing now with other aspects of it. So we can see this half here as being the mitigation part of the story, and this half being the adaptation side of the story, but in the middle is a common set of land use transport stories that pin the two sides together. So on the mitigation half, we looked at energy demand reduction in London. London's target is for 60% reduction by 2025, and if you look at different trends in the transport emissions, you can see that the business as usual line in red is just with increasing population and increasing trips is heading off into the, more and more emissions. But in order to come to a 1.5 degree world, we really need an imminent and large reduction in emissions over the next 10, 20, 30 years. So the transport emissions in London are about 20%, 22% of the total at the moment, but they would increase into the future just based on increased demand and higher population. And the London Mayor's Office has a plan for reduction of those emissions with things like vehicles and different vehicle technologies and different behavioral change. But there's very little drastic change happening. So again, we need to see much bigger efforts to change these emissions. There's also the building emissions, which account for more of the current outputs from London. But some of these things are beyond London's control. So things like transport policy. I mean, London could impose an EV-only policy in the city, but cities in the UK are very worried about sending business elsewhere, so they often don't want to act in isolation. If you look at the things that the IPCC have suggested we need to do in transport to reduce our emissions, you see things like densifying urban landscapes, restructuring freight logistics, modal shift to public transport, walking and cycling, higher passenger occupancy rates, lower weight of vehicles, which are all very nice, and we know all those things would work. But if you look at the actual scenarios that the UK has looked at for EV vehicle uptake, for example, we're looking at, in the most optimistic case, this is the most optimistic scenario with all of the measures they thought of, 4.5% vehicles being sold as being electric vehicles by 2022. So it's a tiny change to the current status quo. So how much of this is going to be solved by electric vehicles? Probably not a lot. We have to start thinking about how do we make behavioral change happen, and how do we make drastic mode shift happen, and things like this. How do we change our urban landscapes, or at least the function of those urban landscapes? So yeah, if you look at, this is Germany's age of cars, there's still a large proportion of cars in Germany that are more than 10 years old. So if we're looking at drastic change in the next 10 years, even if we still sold 100% of electric vehicles tomorrow, it would still be a lag before the technology caught up with the kinds of emission changes we're expecting, or we need to see. And you can see this is across Europe. The number of vehicle sales of alternative fuel vehicles are very low compared to diesel and petrol cars. So total decarbonisation by 2035 under these conditions? Don't know. Now, what do we do about this? Similarly, I don't really know, but it's a problem that we have to face up to, and it's very nice that governments and cities can say, we will reduce temperature rises to 2 degrees, but at the same time, there's no action, or very little action. And the aspirations are nice, but the reality is very different. I mean, these are some examples from the UK. This is the big roundabout I was talking about this morning near my house. But last week, Heathrow Airport expansion, great song and dance about how great that was going to be for the UK economy. No mention at all about climate change in any of the press coverage. Chancellor going to spend lots of money on road improvements, but we've still got these kind of trains trundling around that are 30, 40 years old and are very unattractive to people. And I took this on the way out of the train window on the way here, going along the railway in Germany. This is a kind of transport logistics center with hundreds of lorries parked up outside about 500 meters from the railway line with no railway connection whatsoever into it. And this is the reality that we're working in. We're still carrying on business as usual, at the same time pretending that we're going to achieve 2 degrees global warming. So I would say there's a challenge here that, we've had models since 1947, I think this model's from, of traffic in cities, and we're still looking at little incremental changes around the edges of how do we improve efficiency, or how do we have, small changes. But what we really need to look at are drastic changes and these kind of avoid and shift policies instead of improve policies. So I would say to the people in this room that I genuinely believe the kind of models we have can aid that transition. They can't guarantee it will happen. That's down to individuals and governments, but we can use the models we've got here to really show that things are possible. Whether enough is possible, I don't know, because I haven't run all the models and tested it. I don't have the models to do so, but I think by using the kinds of sophisticated models that the people in this room and the wider community have, we could probably start to say, here, these changes are possible if you put your mind to it, and if we engage the public, and if we have this conversation of what 2 degrees really means. So change is a long process, and it involves institutional change as well as individual change. But models are points at which we can get into the system and say, look, here's what happens if you make this very drastic decision. It's not a bad thing, necessarily. So somebody mentioned this yesterday, the idea of backcasting instead of forecasting. So the Paris Agreement, for once, gives us this really hard target that we have to meet. 2 degrees warming equals this amount of CO2, divided by the countries in the way that it's agreed, equals this amount of CO2 for your country in the next 20 years that you're allowed to emit. How do you do that? How do you get there? What are the options available to us? So quite often we see statements like, oh, we can't, we've run the models and it shows that we can't do that because it'll create congestion and the queues will be too long. Whereas this is Dick Gleeson, who's the city planner in Dublin, who's kind of maybe successfully or maybe unsuccessfully gone the other way around and said, look, we don't care what the models show, we want this. You go away and run your models and show us how we get there, which is a bit of a challenge, but it's another way of looking at what we use models for, I would say. Here's where we need to get to. How do we get there? So in London, these mitigation options are, well, we have transport and domestic and non-domestic energy use. So that the national grid that supplies electricity in the UK, if you look at its future scenarios, there is slow decarbonisation, but it's not, we're still looking at use of coal in 10, 20 years' time. So again, it's a very slow transition. So we really need to think about demand reduction. We can't rely on technology and energy production to solve all of the world's ills. We have to look at demand and people, and how do we achieve that, and how do we model it? And one silver bullet is not going to come along, I don't think. It's really about portfolios of measures. So if we look at this, plus this, plus this, plus this, eventually we might get to the point that we can avoid this kind of catastrophic global warming. So Boris Johnson getting on his bike is probably a start, but there are lots of other factors that we need to consider. And it's for both passengers and freight. And we had this discussion yesterday. I put this phrase in last night to try and summarize what we talked about. If we have energy efficiency, do we just see increased use, or do we actually see a reduction in energy use? So there are a few approaches that people have adopted to trying to look at modeling these transitions. Robin Hickman and David Bannister looked at something almost 7 years ago now, trying to put together these kinds of portfolios that if we introduce sets of measures in London, and this is kind of an interactive tool that they built called VIBAT, you can put together packages of measures and it will show you what kind of reduction you might see in your CO2 emissions from these different packages. Michael's obviously looked at CO2 emissions in his Ruhr model in a very integrated and neat way, which I'm very impressed by. The revisions people, Marshall Eshnick's group at Cambridge and Ing, have looked at sustainable urban development at an agglomeration scale, which is quite interesting as well. One approach I do like is Jonathan Köhler, who is now at the Fraunhofer Institute, has looked at technology transitions using transition theory, which is kind of, I don't know if it's a social theory or an economic theory about how new technologies are adopted into the mainstream. And he's actually modeled the uptake of EV or hydrogen vehicles under different kind of socioeconomic conditions and how you can make this transition suddenly happen and what are the factors that go into that. So there are approaches out there that allow us to do these things. And I would argue we have to try and start plugging some of these approaches together. How we do that, I don't know. But we have to start drawing on experience in other disciplines, perhaps, to think about these rapid transitions and these changes. What's the role of space and urban form in these transitions? Can we encourage them to happen more rapidly by developing an urban form or a city that allows them to happen? And what's the role of our neighbors and our peers in encouraging this? So how radical can we be? This is a book from 1958 by Colin Buchanan in the UK, and there's a quote in here that's about the use of motor vehicles in cities, and he says somewhere, private cars constitute by far the largest group of motor vehicles, but it may be questioned whether they play a key or dominating part in economic affairs. A test that may be applied is to consider what effect it would be if we, by some means, remove all cars from our cities overnight. Supposing this would happen, it seems doubtful whether any severe breakdown or dislocation of business or industry would follow, though there would certainly be much inconvenience. Has anybody modeled the complete reduction and removal of cars from a city in their model to see what the effect would be? And did you see... and was it a disaster? Or did people just change the way they did things?
Well, actually, it's very sad what we talk about is well, actually, well, of course, it's a mistake about it, actually, which is not but I haven't got around to
Yeah. But that's I would argue that's the kind of radical test that we could do just to see what happens. I mean,
I haven't done this, but you can do a back-of-the-envelope calculation because the average speed drops by a factor of 3 for all people involved. So, and if you then take the fact that people are currently spending an hour on traveling to work, you get an estimate of 3 hours, which they need to get to work. And 3 hours instead of 1 hour is more than a minor inconvenience.
But does that mean that then locations
yes,
in the slightly longer term would move to adopt?
You can relocate, but as you know that the willingness to intensify the land use in European cities is close to nil. We would have to forego quite a lot of benefits of economies of scale in production, and both in services as well as in industry. So it would be more than a minor inconvenience and more than negligible losses on productivity.
Yeah, but the key point that I would make here is that these are radical futures, and how far can we go? I mean, I'm not suggesting we ban cars overnight from all of our cities, but I'm suggesting maybe we should be testing in our models much more drastic changes that try and achieve these 2-degree limits that we've set ourselves, and maybe use our models to look at how far can we go, and what would the effects be? So at least we could prepare ourselves for, or have an understanding a bit more about the direction that our economy may head in, or how society may change, or how we might have to change our land use planning policy to accommodate some of these changes. To me, it would be a fun exercise, but it also may be an educational exercise. Sorry, Eric. Got it.
Well, I think another thing you'd have to be looking at, which we generally don't take into account, is the embedded carbon in completely restructuring our cities and our economies without the car, given, much of our society lives in areas that have no transit access, can't walk.
Yep.
So if you remember the car, you're basically making a lot of our land use essentially unlivable. And so would have to be a huge readjustment. And how much carbon would it take to build the apartment buildings, build the new rail lines, build the buses, and what would be the net saving in carbon? Arguably. So I think even UK I think today is very different than what it was in 1958.
It's a long way from where we are at the moment. But the point I would like to try and make is that, these kinds of statements made in 1958 with no modeling underpinning it or anything, it's a nice supposition, but do we have the tools that we could say, well, no, it would be a complete disaster. And have you thought about embedded carbon and all the concrete that it would take to reconstruct your city, et cetera? And at least then we have that discussion underpinned by some modeling evidence, and we can show different scenarios of reducing car use by 50%, by 80%, and much more drastic scenarios that we could test. I say we, I really mean you, to try and at least advance the conversation and to bring back this realism that saying 2 degrees is fine, but actually achieving 2 degrees is a very, very different challenge. And exploring the ways that you might meet the challenge that you set yourself as a government requires, models like you guys have here, and conversations between disciplines, between the construction industry, between planners and engineers, etc. So that was a deliberately provocative slide. So that's the mitigation part of the story, but there's also the adaptation part at the same time. I hope I'm not taking too long here, I probably am. So even 1.5 degrees warming is very significant change, and we have to improve our resilience at the same time. So where do we intervene? How do we adapt? Do we rebuild our infrastructure to be stronger and more able to withstand storms and temperatures? Do we make our cities greener, to try and use nature to solve our problems? Do we change the way we behave? So do we look at soft adaptation with planning policy and behavioral change? And what are the costs and effectiveness of each of these approaches on the function of the city? And how do we do it without sacrificing this demand for mitigation at the same time? So we're looking at, at points of intervention in the system where each of these different adaptations might come in and how effective might they be. So I'll try and rattle through this quickly now, but there is obviously risk from multiple hazards, from heat waves, from flooding, from sea level rise. And the risk is a function of the hazard, which is probably climate change. The hazard changes as the climate changes, but also vulnerability and exposure, which are the socioeconomic component where land use transport models can allow us to look at the change in where people are and how they're exposed to these hazards, and therefore what the risk is. So we've got this is for heat waves, complicated diagram, which I'll boil down to essentially maps of the temperature from a model under different climate scenarios, and then maps of land use from a model under different planning scenarios, a very simple cellular autonomy model in that case, and then some kind of knowledge of building types. So you've got where the buildings are, what kind of buildings they are, what kind of people live in them, and the temperature, and together you can calculate the risk. We're now using much more sophisticated high-resolution models, and it's trying to bring together these different aspects of the risk, and we need models of land use change and population change in order to really understand the future options we have. The population scenarios we use, as I mentioned, is a very simple model that Mike Batty and his team at UCL designed that was meant to be quick and allow us to test lots of scenarios. So it's driven by accessibility. We've got a very simple accessibility model, which we built in GIS that takes trip costs and calculates generalized cost along links by different modes, and we can start producing, these graphs of employment accessible by a given generalized cost, et cetera, under different scenarios. And again, there were future development scenarios for transport infrastructure to show how the city might develop. So each of those transport scenarios had emissions stories, but it also had impacts on where people might go in the city. So we came up with these kind of very broad headline population scenarios where maybe we had everybody moving to the east, where all the free land was, or we had everybody moving to the center to reduce travel emissions, or we had everybody moving to the suburbs to reduce exposure to hazards, etc. Probably totally unrealistic, but they told a story. And then we could use our cellular automata model at the next scale down, if you think Michael Wegener's multi-level model, to look at what these might mean in terms of land development, where population might go. Very simple, no reconstruction in here, just new land take, population increase equals new land at a given density. But that allowed us to look at things like this. Well, what if we have this eastern scenario, all the free land along the river, the brown areas are where people are likely to go based on a set of assumptions and weights. But if we take out the floodplain, you see that there's a lot less land available, so a lot less development. So by feeding in the climate aspect to the story and moving people from the highest risk areas, you reduce the amount of development you can have. And then what that allowed us to do is feed back to the next level up and start looking at the knock-on effects. So by removing the floodplain, sorry about the different colors, I couldn't find one in the same color. You see higher density development essentially because there's the same amount of population increase in the region, but it has fewer places to go. So what we did here was we removed the green belt restriction around the outside of London to see what it might mean, and you get urban sprawl, surprisingly, around the outside. But what this led to was, we could start drawing fairly simple graphs of the amount of land available, the amount of population we can fit in that land, and we can go to city decision makers and say, do you want to protect your green belt? Do you want to keep people out of the floodplain? Do you want to build at higher density? Do you want to drive population out of the city altogether? And essentially, these are the options they have. They have to do something. They have to make a decision. And I wouldn't argue that it's our job as modelers to tell them what that decision should be, but it's our job as modelers to tell them what the implications of those decisions might be. That's direct impacts. There are also indirect impacts. So we're looking at the effect of climate on urban function. This is traffic volume as heavy rainfall happens, and there's a reduction in the traffic volumes. So we're trying to model this using flood models, so that the flood might be a very short-lived event. This was one day, and the next day, the water's gone. But quite often, the traffic problems can last much longer than the flood event lasts. So we're looking at overlaying flood models onto the road network, and a dynamic flood model, if this works, that shows flooding over time. May work, may not. Oh, there we go. So the rainfall happens, the water flows through the city, it takes into account urban drainage and buildings and green roofs and whatever adaptation we want to put in there. But we start to see, most of the time, the water pools on the road network because that's the most prominent open space, and you start seeing where this water is likely to build up. And then you can start seeing where the at-risk points are in your network. And then I go to Kai Hagel and say, can you put these floods into your Matsim model, please? And then see what it means in terms of impact to travel times, and then calculate the costs of those impact to travel times, and then how do we make the case for the need for adaptation to avoid those costs. And we've been developing simple models with Python and Pygame to look at people traveling around, but there are far more sophisticated models out there if we could start linking these kinds of dynamic simulations together. And then we can start to calculate the costs and the benefits of adaptation under different scenarios. So what if we use green roofs all over the city? How does that reduce the costs? What if we protect the most important links in the network? So this is what we're doing here, looking at different adaptation options and how we might target those adaptations. This is all very difficult, but there are ways to make it easier, I would argue, by having discussions that aren't just about climate change that nobody's interested in, but are about wider things. So this is something from Vancouver, where we start looking at health benefits and life expectancy and reduction in air pollution and all the other things that people are interested in that aren't climate change, but are actually benefits to the population as well. And I would argue we need to use models as discussion tools to have these conversations. So simple models that allow us to run scenarios and talk to people and make the case for this transition and the kinds of changes we might want to see in our cities. And one thing we've been looking at is the uncertainty in all of this, running huge numbers of models in an ensemble and then looking at what each of them means. And this is trying to find the best compromise between mitigation and adaptation. Mitigation being the distance from the central business district, and adaptation being whether you're in a at-risk area or not. And it essentially runs thousands of simulations, and we find the Pareto optimal front in those very simple situations. Can we do something like that with other models? So that's the end. Sorry if I took too long, but it's a story I wanted to try and make and bring out the complexities. But I would say it's probably is at the beginning, because I would like to think we've got now not much time to make very big changes, and I'd like to think this gives us an opportunity to really get into this world and start making these sustainability improvements and the changes we need to see. So thank you for listening.
Thank you, Allistair. That's a good reminder how severe the problems are we have to deal with it are ahead of us. For a little bit of time for discussion.
Yeah, thank you. I mean, I think it's pretty clear that we need to make the results somehow speak for themselves in the political arena. The question is, I mean, is there anything you can actually do to support people like us? I mean, essentially what I'm doing is I'm running simulations and then out come numbers. And I always have the problem, how do I translate these numbers now so that a non-expert can actually do something with them? Is there anything you can do to help us, to give me a tool I can just throw them in or something?
Well, I quite like that. I showed you a little screenshot of it, the kinds of tools that, I don't know how far back I have to go here. This kind of tool where there are lots of little colored pictures which show a choice, and under that choice are some model results. And we talked about this morning, that if you have very simple sliders, and then we can take the model results and all the complexity and interesting numbers that underpin them, but reduce them to a story of, is it better or worse on our particular measure that we're interested in? And solutions that are better on lots of measures are better than solutions that are better on fewer measures. So I think, yeah, I mean, there is a challenge in visualization and storytelling, but there are people who are experts in that. And that's the nice thing about working in an interdisciplinary group like the Tyndall Centre. There are psychologists and governance people and communicators. But I think, we have to be brave to maybe talk to people who do animations or cartoons, or people who produce nice infographics, and actually sit down with them and discuss how do we get away from graphs and get towards maybe a more effective communication tool. But again, I mean, it comes down to political choice, doesn't it? So I think if we can show politicians that it's not necessarily a choice of we have to reduce our emissions and make everybody's lives a misery. Actually, we can reduce our emissions and make things better in other ways too, then we're much more likely to get traction on decisions.
Just to pick up that issue, I think the guys who are really good at videos and cartoons are very expensive. And the last quote I had was £8,000 for 1 minute of footage. But it's probably worth it still. So I think. Well, what I want to ask here is probably a greater focus, if possible, on adaptation. And I think some of the adaptations that the households themselves will make will be quite unpleasant in the face of big threats. Right? Currently, people just shut their mind to it when they actually really realize that something's happening. The way that they adapt may not be actually what the government wants. Actually, if the government try to move to calm them, actually it would just get worse. And this sort of things probably still happening, for example, with the Brexit and people applying for Irish passports and all sorts of things are happening. Now, one thing which I hope, because coming back to the comment about the run I did by mistake of not having cars in the system, and I hope this will actually persuade Kai Axhausen to put back a LUTM model in his models. Because what actually happened in this particular one, actually it was quite fortunate. Actually, it turned to, the pattern of land use became more medieval, more like the pattern here. So actually, because the lack of accessibility actually pushed people actually to go to small places to live in greater numbers, and based on whatever the numbers I could allow. I'm not actually sort of holding on to the result, but I think if really it happens that, for example, petroleum fuel simply disappeared, then this sort of places actually will become quite popular because the people will be able to live on the land and do things and get resources from here and so on. So in the model, if we have those flexibilities against the travel time and travel demand, then this spatial equilibrium process actually could work its way through.